Good evening, everyone. And this evening, I have the pleasure of hosting Natasha Hausdorff from Lawyers in Israel, an international barrister, in Stand With Us TV Live. Good evening, Natasha.
Good evening. It's so good to be with you, Fleur.
It's wonderful to be with you. And Natasha, you've been making some waves in the last couple of weeks. I've known you for a long time. I've known how brilliant you are, how clear you are about law, about defending Israel, about the misconceptions of international law, and of course, how the double standards that we always see against Israel. But you did an interview last week with the BBC where to say the woman was speechless, I think, would be an understatement. She really didn't know what to do with you because you were just basically telling her the facts. And there are so many myths about international law, about the way that Israel is waging a defensive war in Gaza, but you just laid it out very clearly. And so I thought it would be great for our audience and the audience here in Stand With Us, who are basically on the front lines of the public diplomacy war, to be educated by you, so you can really put the facts and the law down on the table so that people actually know what to respond when we are accused of all sorts of things, as you can imagine. And so thank you for being with us, Natasha. How has been your experience in the last week? Just tell us a little bit about what you've been involved with and what are you finding in terms of the defense?
Well, the one thing that was utterly unexpected has been the flood of support and messages, emails from all over the world and messages of thanks. It's clearly struck a chord. I'm only sorry that what I've been saying more recently, and I must confess probably for the last 10 years, hasn't gained more traction sooner and is still not being properly broadcast whenever the news is analysing what is going on and these allegations of breaches of international law or war crimes are being levied. And I think that this is the result of a concerted campaign, certainly for well over a decade, of lawfare against Israel. But it is a culmination in many ways of massive misrepresentations of both the facts and the law. And it's extremely good to have these opportunities to try and set the record straight.
Well, I'm really pleased you're here with us because, as you know, I get constantly interviewed. I've got a legal background, but I didn't practice for many years. And you're really right there and putting the facts so clearly. And I really wanted to get to it because actually you've educated me and helped me in my own, my own public diplomacy work. And there are a few things that I really want people to truly understand so they can take forward and defend Israel with confidence. So let's start with the first accusation, which seems so ridiculous, really. It almost seems childish, but this is the constant term that keeps coming up, which is proportionality. And I thought you did a fantastic job of explaining what proportionality actually is, because most people think, 100 dead here, 100 dead there, 100 dead here, 500 dead there, that's not proportional. Whereas means actually something very different. So I'd love it if you could just clarify for us what proportionality is in international law, in war, in laws of conflict.
Well, look, I can completely understand seeing the images coming out of Gaza, that the knee-jerk or instinctive reaction of so many people who don't know what's going on there and clearly aren't educated in the laws of war, the knee-jerk reaction is to cry disproportionate. And what we have to understand is that the scenes that are on display in no way lead us to any conclusion in a legal sense of illegality. And one of the reasons for that is the principle of proportionality, which Israel applies on a broader scale, but also on a strike-by-strike basis. And the laws of armed conflict require that any military commander assesses a proposed strike and assesses the proportionality of that strike in this context by weighing up the expected collateral damage, which is the harm to civilians or civilian structures, against what is the anticipated strategic military advantage sought by the attack. So that is a prospective analysis. It is not an assessment that is made in hindsight, and it is based on the knowledge available to the military commander that is authorizing the strike. And in Israel's case, and this is not the case with every military, but in Israel's case, the legal department of the IDF, the Military Advocate General Corps, are intimately involved in decision-making processes and in the selection of targets and in the striking of those targets. And that proportionality analysis is integral to the green light that is given to those strikes. But the proportionality analysis is also informed by the other principles of international law, namely distinction, which requires responsible armies to distinguish between civilian and combatants and civilian objects and military targets, which Israel does while it conducts that proportionality analysis. And the other key principle here is also that of military necessity. Now, on a macro level, Israel's actions in Gaza after the 7th of October are absolutely necessary. And several people around the world have, on this occasion, acknowledged at least that. But that principle of military necessity applies again to each strike that Israel undertakes. And that links directly to the anticipated military advantage that is sought. In the global sense, the IDF has been clear that it is the destruction of Hamas, the removal of the capability of this terrorist organization to ever threaten Israeli civilians in North again.
So let me get this straight. Let's break it down in language that everybody can understand. So what you're saying is that proportionality is not about these numbers of deaths versus these numbers of deaths. It's about the potential threat that the target that we want to, that we want to hit can have. Is it like a threat to future attacks back to Israel versus whatever collateral damage there is? Could you just clarify that in layman's terms?
No, of course, it's absolutely not as you're describing the weighing up of casualty figures on both sides. And there are a number of reasons for that. Of course, one, that encourages Hamas to continue its unlawful use of human shields, and it is seeking to drive up the casualty figures as much as possible in the Gaza Strip, which is reprehensible. But it's also important to stress that whatever precautions or proportionality exercise Israel conducts is inevitably going to be impacted by the conditions that the IDF are forced to operate in, that situation where Hamas is exploiting the civilian population. And so it's absolutely not an effects-based analysis. It's about the conduct and the intention and the knowledge that is available to whatever military commander is authorizing a strike as and when they are doing so. And Israel is also in a privileged position in terms of the levels of intelligence that it has vis-a-vis, other armies in other armed conflicts. And that necessarily also informs the decision-making process on proportionality. But there are added practices that Israel has developed, again, which are unusual in many other conflicts, which embrace the principle of precaution, making sure that civilians are kept safe as much as possible. And now that is included in the planning of strikes. So when Israel decides the time of day or the angle or the munition that it will select, and you will probably recall that the strikes we saw in Jabalia yesterday were reported to be with bunker busting bombs. And the effect of those was to target the tunnels under the Jabalia refugee camp. And the effect that one saw on the structures above ground were not, in fact, from the munitions themselves, which explode beneath the surface, but from the after effects of that terror tunnel network collapsing. So the planning aspects, the choice of munition, the time of day, and critically also the warnings that Israel is able to offer civilians, not in every case, but in many cases. And we've seen the request for civilians to move to the south of Gaza, away from the intensive fighting in the north, and the Hamas strongholds that are inevitably required to be targeted by the IDF. So all of these factors come into play when the IDF is assessing the proportionality of strikes. And it's important to note that the measures that Israel is taking in this respect go far above, in many respects, the requirements of the laws of armed conflict. They are there as a baseline. But in addition to that, the IDF has a moral and ethical code, and that is what informs the decision-making processes and the constant attempts to reduce the number of civilian casualties that Hamas is seeking to increase.
Well, it's interesting to say that, because 2 days ago, we went to visit an Air Force base, in fact, down south. I can't say exactly where we were. And one of the fighter pilots was basically explaining to us that every target that they set themselves, it goes first to the lawyers. So exactly what you're saying, that every single target is assessed by a legal team to make sure that it is complying with the proportionality, and like you say, even over precaution, and not just proportionality. So then, just to sum up, proportionality is not numbers, it's potential threat versus potential casualties. And Israel then adds on the precautions that most countries wouldn't.
Well, law-abiding countries certainly do take precautions and preventative measures, but I think the ingenuity behind many of those that Israel has developed is unique and is regarded as such amongst other law-abiding armies, including text messages to individual householders, broadcasts on the media, phone calls, and increasingly also, as we saw in previous operations, the use of knock-on roof, which was an Israeli developed method of giving a final warning to a particular building before it was struck.
Amazing. Okay, so now we got through proportionality. Let's talk about sieges, because another very common question is, well, you are breaking humanitarian law by sieging a population and not letting them have gasoline, which we know Hamas is stealing for their underground intricate terror base. But water is a big thing that keeps coming up. I mean, we know that they've let in humanitarian aid in the last week. At the moment, it's on 100 trucks a day. So could you enlighten us a little bit about the laws of siege and when this is breaking human rights law and when it isn't?
Well, there are a lot of aspects of this to unpack. And just before we get to the law, I think there are a few factual misrepresentations that need to be addressed. And this is the context in which Israel has been providing a great deal of the supply to Gaza prior to the start of this war on the 7th of October. And it is right that some 50% of Gaza's electricity was being supplied by Israel through supply lines that Hamas has in fact bombed and destroyed to a large extent. The case with water is similar, although Israel was only providing about 10% of the water that Gaza consumed prior to the start of this war. But again, many of the pipes that supply passed through have also been destroyed by Hamas. So that's the factual background prior to the start of this. Since, of course, in terms of Israel's legal responsibilities, it didn't have any responsibility to provide those supplies prior to the start of this conflict. But of course, while it is fighting Hamas, while there is a military campaign, there is no law and no rule of common sense either that requires Israel to supply its enemy The only requirement, and this is reflected, it's a customary international law requirement, I would say, but it's reflected in Article 23 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, is a requirement to facilitate third parties supplying humanitarian assistance. But there is an important caveat to that, and that is that humanitarian assistance will not be diverted to the enemy combatant forces. Now, the problem we're faced with is not only as a matter of course, is Hamas in complete control of the Gaza Strip, but it has a very well evidenced and documented track record of diverting every sort of supply to its own terror infrastructure, from digging up water pipes and using them as material for rockets, to using the electricity grid to supply its rocket launching infrastructure, to using fuel, withholding that fuel from hospitals, stealing that fuel from UN bodies like UNRWA, and using it to continue the oxygen supply to its terror tunnel network. In those circumstances, even the obligation to facilitate third parties' provision of humanitarian aid does not apply under international law because of the practice of diversion. And so we're faced with a situation where what Israel has done again is above the requirements of international law, but it's acting out of humanity, out of a sense of having a moral compass and wanting to provide assistance to the civilian population of Gaza that is able to move to the south of the country. And they have provided significant amounts of water directly to the south, as well as facilitating humanitarian aid through the Rafah crossing. One thing I would highlight here is the international law obligations on Egypt with regard to the civilian population, which finds itself in such a terrible situation, even in the south of Gaza. And they have obligations to facilitate, I would argue, the safe evacuation of proved civilians, checked so that hostages and terrorists are not smuggled out with them, into the Sinai, into the Egyptian side of Rafah, where they can be properly looked after by international humanitarian organizations without diversion to Hamas. That is critical.
Why does Egypt have an obligation?
Well, as what we saw with respect to the war in Ukraine, neighboring countries acted as responsible entities and took in fleeing civilians.
Yeah.
Here, Egypt has been clear that it has closed its borders. Now, it may be that many people argue that Egypt knows the Muslim Brotherhood threats better than many in the region, but that cannot be an excuse for the international community allowing Egypt to behave in that particular fashion.
And Natasha, when they say to you, but the hospitals are running out of energy, of fuel, and people are going to die, and babies are going to get disconnected from their incubators because there's no electricity. What you're saying is, we have no obligation to supply any type of energy needs to the aggressor in a conflict that we didn't start. And under humanitarian law, what do we say?
Well, on a factual level, we need to be calling out Hamas for withholding supplies from these hospitals. And
yes, the estimate is they have 2-3 months worth of supplies,
which they are keeping for their terror network and withholding from the hospitals that these supplies are meant to go to. So that is a starting point. But over and above that, of course, one of the issues that we're being faced with now, that Israel has released a great deal of information about the use, in particular, of the Shifa hospital in Gaza City as a Hamas command and control center.
Right.
It was very interesting to note the International Committee of the Red Cross's reaction to this information. Very interesting, which was to remind Israel that according to them, targeting a hospital would be a war crime, a protected building like that. That is incorrect in circumstances where it is being used as a command and control center for Hamas. In those circumstances, those hospitals or schools lose their protected status and become a legitimate military target. Again, it's a matter of customary international law, but it's also reflected in Articles 12 and 13 of Additional Protocol 1. So for the International Committee of the Red Cross to have tweeted that, as opposed to reminding Hamas that the use of a hospital as a terror base is a war crime, is, I think, a very recent and very powerful indication of how international bodies that are charged with upholding the rules of law, and in particular international humanitarian law, are a huge part of the problem in encouraging Hamas to continue to breach the laws of armed conflict, to exploit those breaches, and to seek to invert the situation by accusing Israel of things that it hasn't done.
Well, just to add on the point of the Red Cross, 2 days ago, the Israeli Prison Service received a letter from the Red Cross being very concerned about the well-being of the Hamas prisoners slash savage terrorists that we have now in our jails from October 7th. So the International Red Cross are concerned about the Hamas prisoners that we have here, but have not moved a finger to check on our hostages over there in Gaza and to see what their well-being is. And
one
so
point just also to note on that, it's a technical one perhaps, because Israel does uphold a standard of treatment of prisoners which is unparalleled in the Middle East. But as Hamas is a non-state actor, it's a non-regulated army, those terrorists who have been taken into Israeli custody do not have prisoner of war status. So it's interesting. I haven't seen that communication from the international
this is
community.
the last 2 days. I mean, it's embarrassing. And today, actually, I called on the international community, especially Christian community around the world, to hold the International Red Cross accountable for their very obvious bias and essentially aiding and abetting terrorists. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. Okay, Natasha, one last point, because I think you've really cleared things up for us. Collective punishment, another word that we keep hearing about, hearing a term over and over. Israel is breaking international law by using collective punishment. And I know we've covered some of the things with proportionality and with the precautions that we take, but would you give us a summary on the collective punishment accusation and why it does not hold water legally?
Well, for all of the reasons, of course, that I've expressed about Israel's approach to armed conflict generally and to this conflict with Hamas specifically in Gaza. But I would say that the use of this term, collective punishment, is a prime example of what we are seeing, which is a modern blood libel being levied against the state of Israel. So in the same way that in the Middle Ages, Jews were accused of killing Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals, the modern blood libels manifest themselves in the context and in the language of international law and human rights. There is zero evidence basis for this notion of collective punishment. It is exactly the opposite. The IDF have been very clear about their aims, and also specific about their aims in targeting Hamas terror infrastructure. And in that context, I think it's also really important that we remember that this is not just about Hamas, that out of the 3,000 terrorists that infiltrated into Israel on the 7th of October, there were also Palestinian Islamic Jihad members affiliated with the PLO, and that all of those terrorists, no matter what banner they coalesce under, are funded by the payment of terror salaries under the Pay for Slay program by the so-called moderates in the West Bank, by the Palestinian Authority. So that has to be taken into consideration just when we're considering Israel's initiatives against Hamas. But in terms of encapsulating the blood libels against Israel in this case, and misrepresenting international law and Israel's not just right, but also obligation, duty to its citizens to defend itself, this phrase collective punishment is abhorrent. No international lawyer, no military expert and no educated individual, I would warrant, should have any truck with phraseology like that.
Is it about intention, Natasha? The idea of collective punishment?
Intention certainly plays a significant role in this, and in the context of this libel, we're seeing an attribution of evil intent to Israel.
Exactly. So Israel has made it its intention to dismantle the terrorist infrastructure. That's what we're going for. We're warning, we're doing everything that we've already spoken about. And so collective punishment has zero applicability here. What you're saying is.
That's absolutely right. And when you look at the evidence of the measures that Israel takes, that is all evidence of Israel's intention to prevent civilian casualties. So that is being inverted. And the users of this phrase are attributing an evil intention to Israel, which is simply not borne out by the evidence, but also not borne out by anyone who has ever visited Israel, who has ever engaged with the Israeli Defense Forces, let alone their legal department, and knows the lengths that they go to ensure that every aspect of the planning and approach to armed conflict that Israel is involved in does the exact opposite of the sort of indiscriminate allegations that are being levied against Israel.
Natasha, thank you so much for being a legal warrior. I don't think anybody expected or wanted to be in this situation right now. We're all using whatever specialty we have, and you've been absolutely amazing. And we thank you on behalf of the State of Israel. I know your dad's Israeli, and you come here a lot, and you do fantastic work for Lawyers for Israel. And so we really, really appreciate your expertise, your wise words, your support. Thank you again for educating us and for defending us. Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you, Fleur, for everything that you're doing, and the hope of better times ahead.
Amen.